All right, so today we are looking at the Zhou and Shin Dynasty, and kind of taking a look at what happens and some of the transitions that take place from the Shang. And then, of course, the Shin Dynasty, which is very different from the Shang or the Zhou. And in fact, the Shang and the Zhou have a lot of similarities in how they run their empire and kind of the function of the emperor and on all those aspects. And then you get into the Shin Dynasty, and it's completely different, in part because of legalism, which we looked at with the recordings I already made of the philosophies and of lessons for women. And then just part of how they ultimately set up the state. So to give you an idea before we get into writing some notes down, here's the map that shows the Zhou Dynasty. And I don't have one. I guess I should have put the Shang up so you could see. The Zhou Dynasty, they took over the Shang. So they incorporated their territory. It is a little bit larger. So they end up expanding beyond the Shang slightly. It's not massively significant, but they do expand some. And it's certainly at their height, because we'll see, I have another map to show you when we get to the Warring States period, where you can clearly see how this whole area, the whole of the Zhou Dynasty is essentially going to be split up into vassal states. And these vassal states, I think this is Shin's right here, are going to be fighting to the point where then just a little tiny capital of the Zhou is all that they actually control left. So they for a while, they have quite a bit of power, and it goes through these various stages of time. So technically, the Zhou Dynasty was a very long period in time. If you count all the way up until they, lose control of their capital. But realistically, right, that they weren't really in charge of a lot by the end. Okay, so, right, you have the dates here, 1046 to 256 BCE. Within this, you have several periods of times, and we don't have the time or the capacity to look at all of these in great detail, since it is world history and it requires us to go through thousands of years of history in different periods. But I wanted to lay it out just so you get an idea, that you have the Western Zhou period, and then you have the Eastern. And then within that, you have the spring and autumn period. And then you have the Warring States period. And it's in these two right here, the spring and autumn and the Warring States period, that they, by this point, have a very little centralized control. And yet, still clung on to their attempt at holding on to this, right? So it was long. There was also a very long period of time where you could argue that the Warring States period shouldn't really count as the Zhou period, because, they were a capital by the end of that. And really wasn't their dynasty anymore, even if it still technically was. So just keeping that in mind, right? That yes, it was a very long dynasty, but not always through centralized control. And we'll look at how they structure things in a minute. Of course, one of the things that I talked about at the end was that they took over the Shang Dynasty. And so you have, from that start, right, that there's an issue with, if you're taking over and overthrowing a king, the pesky thing called filial piety, right? And we already looked at filial piety, but filial piety ends up getting connected to not just we'll put family, but it's not just family. It's also the government. And so you have this obligation to follow with extreme loyalty and devotion to the king, which pretty sure that then falls under not overthrowing them, because then that's like the opposite of loyalty completely. So then the Zhou are like, okay, well, we want to justify this. How do we do it without breaking filial piety? And what they end up coming up with is the mandate of heaven, or the mandate from heaven. And the mandate of heaven ends up being like a great justification for control or taking over, right? And so what it set up essentially was that, well, one, the very first thing that they do is the Zhou were great at propaganda, and this was propaganda, as we'll see with some of their other types of propaganda that they use. But they set it up, and in it, we'll say, pretend that it came from the Xia dynasty. And so this way, if someone's like, hey, well, you just wrote that, you know, you can't claim that you have the mandate of heaven. You just wrote the document to fit your needs. Oh, no, we didn't. This came from the Xia dynasty. And the Xia dynasty had always been revered as one that was from wise kings, and that were knowledgeable and intelligent, and you know, sages essentially in many ways. And that kind of had been the story that had been passed down about the Xia dynasty. So it worked perfectly in terms of picking the Xia dynasty to have established the mandate of heaven. And in this way, they could say, well, it was already here. We're just following it. And so that was their first, that's definitely, right, if we go, that's the propaganda right there, is claiming that, you know, they didn't write it, but the Xia dynasty did, or had it and used it. And so what it did is it was set up to suggest that rulers, that they get a mandate from heaven. And again, I did do a recording on the primary sources, including the mandate of heaven, the philosophies, and lessons for women. So I'm going to cover the basics here, but to look at the specifics of the primary source, watch the recordings that are just the recordings on the primary sources. Since there were several recordings, I knew that was going to take too much time if I put it into this lecture. So please don't forget to go actually listen to those, because I go into more detail and we look at the actual sources versus me just kind of giving you a brief summary of the events. Okay, so the rulers were given a mandate from heaven. And it sets up essentially within this that the rulers have a responsibility to uphold essentially heaven's principles of proper behavior as a king. And in it, they list like the different values that make up a good king, right? One of them is virtue. You have filial piety, you have virtue. Here, I'll just put a couple. I'm not going to do all of them again, since I already went over this in the other recording. But you have virtue, filial piety, loyalty, intelligence, etc., etc., right? These are the good qualities of a king. And when they practice these, right, when they follow these, we'll put it here. If you follow this, then you keep the mandate of heaven. And then I guess in theory, no one can take it from you, right? Because then that would be breaking filial piety. However, if you fail to uphold these values as a ruler, then what happens is you lose the mandate from heaven. And if you lose the mandate from heaven, then it's fair game for anyone to take you over. And it goes to the idea that whoever overthrows you or takes over now has the mandate. And so this is the clever part of this, is the idea that the Zhou can say, well, we didn't technically overthrow you. You lost the mandate of heaven, the Shang, right? They say this to the Shang. You lost the mandate of heaven. And it was given, bestowed onto us. So really, we didn't break filial piety because the mandate of heaven transferred over to us. I mean, it's a clever way to circumvent the whole, we just totally said screw filial piety, when that's a central aspect of their society. So they use this to justify taking over from the Shang. Now, one of the probably unintended consequences of this that the Zhou didn't think about, because ultimately this then ends up getting used to justify their overthrow, right? So I'm sure that they didn't plan for it to continue to be used. So like, oh, this is a one-time use only, and then it goes away. Is that you get what's called the dynastic cycle. And there's a good PowerPoint image for that. So let's look at that here. You have this idea, and it's a little blurry, and I apologize for that. I'll read it through, right? A powerful new dynasty receives the mandate of heaven. So, right, this is the start. Although it's a cycle, so it repeats, right? The new emperor reforms the government and restores peace and harmony. Life improves for the people because the government provides both prosperity and protection. A new generation passed. The new dynasty grows old and corrupt. And that's emphasized a lot. The government raises taxes, forces men into emperor's service. The old dynasty loses the mandate of heaven. This creates disaster, invasions. The people rebel and unite under a strong leader who defeats the emperor, who then gets the mandate from heaven. And so you get into this dynastic cycle of, wash, rinse, repeat in terms of justifying overthrowing rulers. And to some degree, what is important with it is it does allow for change when you have governments that become corrupt. Because it is easier for governments to be corrupt long term if ultimately you can't get around filial piety. So it does play that important role. But the other issue, of course, is that ultimately it allows for that justification to take over because the mandate of heaven is being given to you because you're now the next rightful ruler who's upholding the values that the previous one was not. And so they basically, it's like they lost it themselves. Right, so you didn't overthrow them. Either they lost it themselves or heaven revoked their right to filial piety and their right to rule. But it does certainly, you see this dynastic cycle happen more frequently in certain periods in time. And the mandate of heaven was used as that justification. So like long-term significance is it provides justification for overthrowing rulers and creating a cycle of replacing dynasties throughout Chinese history. Okay, so the next thing this is propaganda. Now that was C, so we'll D. We'll look at propaganda here, and mandate of heaven. Right, if you were just going to list all the propaganda, should go under this as well. So I'm just going to throw it in there, even though we just talked about it, just so it's clear that this was used as propaganda. But there's other ones as well. So we just wrote about it. I'm going to just leave it at that. The Zhou were masters at propaganda, and you think about why? What leads them to be really good at propaganda? Well, probably the realization that we just created this mandate of heaven. Now we've got to prove to the public that we deserve to keep it. Because if the public believes that you are corrupt or that you don't deserve the mandate of heaven, that's just going to give fuel to the fire for someone else to take over. And so they did from basically the start create a lot of different ways of propaganda to reinforce the Zhou were the rightful rulers who had and maintained the mandate of heaven. One of the ways that they did this was through writing. And there was a variety of things that they did with this. You have legal codes, and this could be just as generic as saying, we created law, to setting up legal codes to reinforce their control. They did stuff with administrative work, the bureaucracy of running things. But this one goes with this one, right? The administrative work connects to this, which is that they created records of lists of good things the Zhou kings did. So it's essentially the top 10. Right here, here's our list of all the good deeds we have done, and here's how we've kept the mandate of heaven. So, right, they use writing to reinforce to the people, and to like public record and to the history, essentially, and even if that's unintentional, that this is like, these are the things we've done, so you can't claim we don't have the mandate of heaven. They also created a royal calendar and used the royal calendar to create holidays and festivals around important events that the Zhou rulers did, again, to remind the people why the Zhou have the mandate of heaven. They also commissioned a lot of ritual bronze vessels. Oh. These were, I always end up hitting stuff. So these were large vessels. The ritual ones were very large, and they would be put on public display and tended to also be connected to important events or conquest or values that the Zhou rulers did. So they used a lot of this to promote themselves, to try to keep themselves in power. And for a while it works. Inevitably you have a problem with inherent structure and system that ends up getting created, right? So that gets into our next aspect. Let's put that as social structure, we'll say. But the social structure is also going to be, we'll say, social and political structure. Okay, so with this, if we're looking at the social and the political, like the government structure, for kind of how the structure of the government worked is that you had, so here, well, let's put government first. You had, of course, the rulers, the kings, and then you had the nobles. And in this group, these were often the rulers, not all of them, but of the vassal states, right? But you had nobility that were given that. And what you get with vassal states was land, and in return, they were supposed to provide military support. So land was given, and they provide military support. Now, the reason why do this, right? Ultimately, it's the idea that it was too large to be controlled by a single centralized state or place. We'll say government, that would be the right word. Okay. We could use the Persians that we're going to talk about later to showcase that it is possible to have a kind of strong centralized control of a very, very large area. Nonetheless, traditionally speaking, it is hard to hold on to a very vast area, especially if there's a lot of regional differences. And so by implementing and putting in people that you trust to run those areas as kings or governors, or however you set up the system, who are supposed to pledge loyalty to you, that is part of it, is that they're pledging loyalty and fealty to the Zhou king. And in return, they're given land and control over a large territory where they're basically a king. And they are supposed to provide military support to the Zhou for expansion, for conflict of outside warfare or whatever. This works for a while, just like it did with the Shang. It almost inevitably breaks down when a vassal king decides that they want power. And if you have multiple vassal kings that all decide, yeah, wait, we want power, it leads to, well, the Warring States period is essentially what it ultimately leads to. Okay, so then so that's the structure of what was going on with the Zhou, right? Is that they followed that vassal state tradition and continued that process, and that the Shang had done. And while they have a strong, which is why there's so much emphasis on propaganda, you've got to convince the vassal states that you're the rightful ruler. And you do that not only through filial piety, but through the mandate of heaven, which they had used to also overthrow, which again becomes their liability, because now the vassal kings of the Zhou dynasty can claim the same thing. That like, well, we don't think you have the mandate of heaven anymore, so it's mine. And then all the vassal states during the Warring States period were like, no, it's mine, no, it's mine, no, it's mine, which is why then they all fought, because they all decided to claim the mandate of heaven. So after the nobles, you have the administration or officers of the court, right? That's the bureaucracy. That's the administrators that are doing all of the day-to-day runnings of the empire. They are the higher ups, though, because then you also have the ministers who are part of the administration, and bureaucrat as well. So these are the lower level ones. Well, here, we'll put that. Technically, the officers of the court are administrators as well, and part of the bureaucracy of that. But the officers are the higher level. And then you have aristocratic military. And this is important because this gets changed as it moves towards the Warring State period. In this period of time at the beginning of the Zhou Dynasty, only nobility could be part of the military. The poor were not included in this system. Then if we look at the social structure then and how that played out, you have the, again, king and ruler always on top, nobility, the nobles. Then you have the military, and again, because the military was part of the nobility, then you had commoners, and then serfs or slaves at the bottom. Right, and so that was kind of the social structure or hierarchy of the Zhou. This works again for a while until you start having constant warfare, and then ultimately this, especially here, is going to have some changes. And the vassal states also go through some changes throughout the period in time as well, with who they try to put in charge. So let's look at problems and decline. And then we'll look at the PowerPoint for a couple of those things that I have. Because some of the changes go within this region. One is they do have strong influence and power with the centralized Zhou territory, which isn't necessarily a problem at first. So with the centralized Zhou territory, which that is the central area. So if this is the whole Zhou territory, that technically is part of the Zhou Dynasty, there was a central area that was very strong. And that was very influential and the center of power. The problem was, right, is that they had limited power outside of this centralized area. And the size of that, let's put it like that, kept shrinking over time. So they had a stronger, larger centralized territory that through the spring and autumn period and then the Warring States period continued to shrink. And they never had full centralized control over the entire region that we saw with that map. So that in itself creates a problem. Oops, not there yet. Then you also have, as I already mentioned, the mandate of heaven, which creates a problem and allows for decline. They ended up having to give the regional rulers, the vassal states, increased autonomy, which usually doesn't go well. I suppose it could, but one of the things that you end up having with this is that creates a stronger desire for control by the vassal states. They now have more autonomy, they have more freedom, and this is going to lead to warfare and conflict ultimately. The other issue that you have, or change, so let's look at changes, right? Specifically with the Warring States period. Okay, so this what this ultimately creates, actually let me put that first because then we'll look at changes. So all of these issues and these problems created a slow, steady decline. This was not immediate. We're going through and only covering, so much, but it was a slow and steady decline of control and power by the Zhou. They didn't lose it all at once. They weren't invaded and then taken over. It was this very slow process that took place. Even the Warring States period took a really long time. So even once they did transition to fighting everyone for territory and control of who would be the next ruler, the Zhou held on for a really, really long time. So this was, like I said, over long periods of time where that slowly the Zhou could be argued were ineffective, or the vassal states were becoming more powerful, which also happened. As soon as they gave them more autonomy and power to run the vassal states, they almost became like separate kingdoms that were not connected to the Zhou dynasty at all. So then people started questioning, well, why would we give our taxes to them? Because they're corrupt and they're using the taxes only to enrich themselves. We're not really part of the Zhou dynasty. And so you get this easy justification for why there was no reason to be attached to the Zhou, that they were just bleeding you dry economically, but not providing anything in return. So one of the changes, of course, was to the vassal states and the rulers, that they changed multiple times throughout the whole period to try to fix the problems. Changes to, we'll say, regional leaders. The other issue was the military. So, right, you have an aristocratic military. What do you think the main issue becomes with this? It's limited, right? You only have so many nobles. And yet you have this vast reservoir of peasants and commoners, but they can't be in the military because it's only for the nobility. So what happens is throughout the Warring States period, the military shifts to commoners. And they end up creating a very strong and large professional army made up of the peasants. This can have its own problems with peasants then wanting land, money, say in the government. It varies. But inevitably, when you do bring it, which is part of what was the appeal not to bring them in. But part of the thing is when you bring them in, then ultimately you're going to have this as a situation where then peasants are going to start demanding things as well because they're participating in the military. But for the immediate change, right, by shifting to allow commoners to be part of the military, that they did vast military recruitment and conscription in order to have a massive army to defend against the constant onslaught of the warring states. The other thing that's connected to the military was new military techniques and weapons that by necessity emerged during this time. So, for example, you have fighting styles, such as you have different types of how to have like formations and things like that. You also have like the art of war that was written during this time. Not surprisingly, when everything kind of gets centered around fighting during the warring states period. And then we also have philosophies, right? Where we're going to, I guess we can keep it under here since I'm just giving a brief synopsis. The first one that emerges is Confucianism. And this was done specifically, right, as a direct attempt to make sense of the declining loyalty towards the Zhou. To the Zhou, as well as restore control and power to the Zhou by getting people invested in wanting to be part of the government. Before we continue on with the key ideas of Confucianism, let's just look at a few things here. So, right, I mentioned writing, right, for propaganda. These are bamboo books, and they were strips of bamboo that then are weaved together or tied together with thread. And then you have the writing that, and you can have pictures too that go down, right? So you read it like that. And this is what they look like rolled up. And here you can actually see where you then have an image drawn on multiple bamboo sticks. And you had like single bamboo sticks that could have writing as well. But the bamboo books were then the series of sticks that were put together that when unscrolled provides you a book. The Shang, there's evidence that the Shang used this as well. But the Zhou were really masters at using writing to promote their own interest in propaganda. So these are really cool because it's so unique. It's not something you see in other cultures that they used. And this is obviously way, way before the actual book with paper and bound together comes about. The other way that writing was used during this time was with scrolls. So you have paper scrolls, and there was definitely Chinese scrolls, scroll art, which were meant to be unscrolled as you viewed it and giving you a series of images as you keep unscrolling it in the process. There's like a process that part of the art is connected to unscrolling or unrolling, right? And so here you have then the scrolls, but scrolls were common. The Greeks, the Romans, they all used scrolls for their, like you have libraries of scrolls. But that was all done on paper. Whereas here with the bamboo books, right, it was a more durable, long-lasting material, so that it's preserved a lot better than paper, which is pretty flimsy. Then we have the ceremonial vessels, bronze ceremonial vessels. There was jade that was used in ceremonial pendants and jewelry and things like that as well. But these vessels were often very, very large. This one's a smaller one, but they made really super massive ones. And they displayed them not only in the palace, but they had public displays, which would often, on the vessel itself, commemorate important events, special things that the Zhou did. They would like dedicate these vessels to the success of whatever thing the Zhou were putting forth. And here's a jade pendant, which again I mentioned before when we were looking at the different artifacts. Jade is not only prized, but the carvings and the use in jewelry and pendants and in furniture was a constant in China. So here's the Warring States period map. As I mentioned, you have this here, right, is like the Zhou city capital. You have all these, here's the Shin, right? All of these vassal states that end up all fighting for control. And so that's what I mean by it's like technically the Zhou period. But this is what they end up getting themselves is right. They had when they started, they had a much stronger centralized area and larger. But over time, in that slow, steady decline, right, it kept moving in and in until it was just the capital. And they were essentially surrounded by a whole bunch of vassal states that no longer were functioning as vassal states and instead were fighting each other. And they didn't all just coordinate, and they all had their own self-interest. So they didn't all just coordinate and attack the Zhou and quickly remove them, which would have probably been a faster process. Instead, they fought each other. They fought with each other. It varied in what they did. And so you ended up in this long, protracted war, which is why it created the necessity to bring in thousands and hundreds of thousands of commoners for soldiers, because it was the only way they were going to manage holding off and fending off these vassal states for as long as they did. But that certainly has some principles and roles in, I think, legalism when we look at that in a minute for rejecting nobility in such a harsh way. Because it was, they may have been in the military, but they were certainly looked down upon compared to the officers that were still largely nobility. So yeah, they get themselves into a bit of a pickle in the process. I mentioned that there was new military equipment, technology, weapons. This is a bronze spear. They came up with not only new military tactics, but more deadlier weapons in the process. I mean, really, the Warring States period created this massive centralized focus on warfare and fighting. So besides the philosophies, and then they created the philosophies which were looking to stop that, right? They all had a common goal, peace, stability, to end the conflict and fight. Now there was other underlying desires and goals too. Confucius, right? His goal was to restore control to the Zhou Dynasty. The other two didn't have that same purpose, but they all had the same purpose of stability and peace. How do we end the fighting? Because after hundreds of years of the Warring States period, people were tired of that, and they wanted stability and peace. But the first was, like I said, Confucius was created in connection to that. So while they all had those common goals, right, of establishing and we could look at that, like the establishing rules and structure of government that would be strong enough to stay in control. So let's well, we could do a side note here. Common goals. Okay, of the three philosophies. We'll just pick up after this, because I do think this is important to address what they were, so you can, it makes sense then when we looked through these and you talk about when I looked at the primary sources and that recording, the specifics of what was in each one, gives you a better insight into why that is when you understand these common goals that they had. So, right, it was meant to create, establish a type of rule or control, if not a clear-cut ruler and government, control or government, that would be strong enough to what? End, to stay in power. And I think legalism makes clear sense within that structure. Maintaining peace, that you create a system that allows for the peace to remain. Also, right, peace and stability. I mentioned those. Those go hand in hand. Also, reestablish order in China. The Warring States period was chaotic. So you have the philosophies as a sense of trying to understand order. I mean, we'll see Taoism isn't really looking to structure a new order system, but they are looking to understand it, right? How does order work? What is control? Well, maybe there isn't. So instead, let's look at nature and what does nature do and how do you follow that path? So, right, Taoism is kind of a rejection of that there is a way to control and have order and by force. And so it has to be done a different way. Or not even all exactly at all, right? Okay, so those are some of like the common goals. So back to Confucius then. So we're gonna skip back down to C over here, but that, remember, goes with Confucianism here. The goal with Confucianism, right, we talked about, was to give it to the Zhou to reinforce this idea of the Zhou in charge. Now, part of this, and I did mention this, people are inherently good. And so the goal is to nurture that, to get them invested with the government. Right? If you can educate, if you can get these people involved in wanting to be part of the government, then instead of rebelling and fighting against, they will want to follow. They will want to. And the idea is that the state then and the ruler was to take on the model of a Chinese family and filial piety and lead by virtue. And then the other people, where there was a focus on this idea of the virtue of the public man, or the good-natured nobleman. There's lots of names for it. So virtue of the public man. That this would be what the height of what people should aspire to. And the main virtues would be courtesy, justice, and moderation. Right? And all while serving the government and the ruler. And their purpose, right, would be to, serve, but also to advise the ruler and make government policies that were fair. Okay, and then, right, this helped rulers follow the mandate of heaven. And so the idea was, if you had everyone behind you helping you follow the mandate of heaven, then there wouldn't be that conflict. There wouldn't be this constant warfare. All right, the next one was Taoism. With Taoism, right, this is the idea of the path or way, specifically of nature. And this philosophy was the best government was the least government. And again, for all of these, please watch the primary source video. I go into more detail with this. But ultimately it was that rulers that that are seen the least, that are known the least, is the best possible way. Minimal involvement, the least amount of involvement that you can have. And rulers should that they should spend their time, instead of forcing their will upon the people, which ultimately leads to warfare, they should follow the way of nature, right, or the path, through meditation and observation, not action, right? Observation. And because one of the things, and then lastly, all extremes should be avoided. And I think that definitely goes into this idea that, right, warfare is an extreme, because even extremes that are meant to be benevolent can go awry. That's the belief behind that. So let's look at, we got two here now, right? They both have those common goals, and yet they're very, very different. The same was later, especially during the Han Dynasty, that someone was Confucius by day, Taoist by night. One, Confucianism was set up to be more explicit in how it could function as a government structure. Taoism was not. And they certainly had different conclusions about what the problem was, right? So Confucianism was just that we weren't nurturing these noble-minded men, the virtues of the public man, to want to be involved and help keep the king on track and run a proper, virtuous government that they were invested in. And because people are inherently good, if you could get them to be invested, then things would go well. Taoism was basically like the root of the problem stems from the ruler and the government forcing themselves into control, forcing their will on the people, and being too extreme. Instead, by removing oneself as much as possible from that role, from focusing on meditation and observation and less on policy making and forcing your own will, the people will enact policy and be happier, and there will be less conflict and warfare because you're ultimately not imposing your will on the people in a way that will make everyone unhappy. Of course, here's the problem. Taoism is not realistic in a government because that type of government would just get trampled on by someone who had a much stronger philosophy of control, like legalism. Legalism would have trampled all over Taoism if Taoism had attempted to become the government policy. And I think everyone knew that, which is why it wasn't even tried. Confucianism and legalism became government policies. Taoism never did, and was much more popular as a personal practice. So much so the Han Dynasty, like I said, they incorporated Confucius policy into education, into every aspect of life. And the government was run with that, with a cohesiveness of legalist sentiment. And so thus, Confucius by day, Taoist by night was the popular saying, with that concept of you have to be Confucius by day because you're a government official, because the government, the society, everything's structured, education is structured around Confucianism. But in your own personal life, Taoism was more appealing because it focused on meditation, letting go of your selfish interest, and instead, focusing and observing how nature worked and trying to mirror and moderate yourself to that. So it's a peaceful kind of a personal philosophy, but it's too peaceful. It's too passive. Taoism is too passive to be a strong government structure to maintain control. Because again, legalism, things like legalism would then walk all over Taoists and their philosophies. So legalism was the third. This was the idea that too much freedom leads to trouble. And the reason that too much freedom leads to trouble is because people are inherently bad. And because people are inherently bad and freedom leads to too much trouble, you have to force them to be good. And you do this through punishment, mostly, and some reward. I mean, it says punishment and reward equally. It's called the two handles in the reading. But the reality is that punishment was far more practiced in that, right? People are inherently bad, and they're inclined to selfishness and irresponsibility. So the government, and specifically the ruler, right, have a responsibility to the people to maintain peace and stability, to basically restrain and control the population. Through force, if necessary. And basically, yes, it was necessary. But that this creates the same thing, is right? This still creates that peace and stability. That all of them wanted, right? They all believed, and we can put that here, right? That this was the best way to create peace and stability and ultimately end warfare was through their method. So it's interesting, right, that you have from this constant conflict three very different structures. Legalism then suggested you needed a super strong centralized power, right? A very, very strong centralized ruler that would have the force and will to require it, if you will. And then there was also this general idea of setting up the structure of society to have this happen within legalist structure. So this included censorship, right? You had to manage what people read, what they looked at. We'll see within the Shin Dynasty, it goes down to what they think too. You also need to have strong education about the state, essentially state patriotic learning, that it was going to be standardized to emphasize the patriotic nature of the Shin Dynasty. You are ultimately to crush any signs of independence, because that would lead to bad. Because remember, people are inherently bad. And so if you allow independent thought and action, even if they're initially well-intended, that it's going to go poorly. And then extreme emphasis on loyalty. I mean, if you use, which we'll see with the Shin Dynasty, if they use this, I don't remember what number. Let me look while I'm talking about this. That ultimately it's a dictatorship. It's nothing else in that sense. It can't be, because we're on. I didn't do any other but two. It has to be a dictatorship because you have to have someone who has full and complete and utter control over everyone else. Okay, so from the Warring States period, eventually the Shin Dynasty emerges as the winners. All right, I had to get my charger. I realized my battery was almost going to die. That would be the worst, to have the power die in the middle of the lecture. All right, the Shin Dynasty. The Shin Dynasty wins, and the emperor, who ultimately is the main emperor of the Shin Dynasty, was like 13 at the time when he takes over, and largely legalism and the principles of legalism then were the person who set up that was one of the main advisors. And so the Shin Dynasty ends up formulating itself under basically strict legalist principle, right? They don't adapt it. They use strict legalist principles. And and the problem with legalism, when you're following it very strictly, is that it ultimately becomes too harsh, which is why I mentioned the dictator aspect of it. That's the only way and route for it to go, which is why the Han Dynasty synthesizes the two. They take some of the key components because there are some benefits to legalism. But if you follow it exactly, it's way, way too harsh. And ultimately that authoritarianism never lasts because people become ultimately dissatisfied of being forced into slave labor for the massive workforce that the Shin Dynasty used. One of the things that's unique about the Shin Dynasty too is that they actually fully unified China under a single emperor. So you have the Shang and the Zhou, but they used vassal states. The Shin Dynasty didn't. And they didn't because their whole emphasis was on this massively strict centralized government backed up by the military. So the military was a massive aspect. And they continued kind of the process of merit, right? In the sense of the shift to commoners, that it was not an aristocratic military. It was based on merit. And so was the government, right? So you have military and then you have government officials, which was also based on merit. In fact, really the Shin Dynasty looked to eradicate nobility as much as possible. So they had a direct problem with nobility, with nobles, and specifically the idea that they were greedy and selfish. And this led to problems, to conflict and decline. Again, everyone's inherently bad. And so instead, it needs to be focused. And you can see the dislike of nobility in the primary sources with the recording I went over. It's very palpable. Legalism does not like nobility. And it's instead focused on merit. So that in itself isn't a bad thing, to have the emphasis be merit over birth. And there's some other aspects that uniformity can be good and bad. Some of the things so there was a very strong sense of uniformity because that reinforced centralized control of the government. So where it's positive, well, there were fixed weights and measures, right? These things make society more efficient and easier to navigate versus hundreds of different ways to measure things. The roads were uniform in size, and this led to better. It's like freezing and not writing all the time. This leads to more trade and travel. if you have and roads were uniform and constructed. I guess it doesn't matter if they're uniform if you don't make them. There was vast building projects that took place, and the constructions of roads was one of them. Standardization of currency, and that is important for, you know, buying stuff, not having to have exchange rates across the empire. If everything has the standardization of what money you're using, then, right, it makes it easier to go anywhere in the empire and purchase things, trade, sell, travel. They created a standardized system of writing. Again, because there were lots of dialects, you create a universal one as the official language. And then that way everyone learns that. They still learn their dialect, but they learn that, and then everyone can communicate with everyone. Protection because of the military, right? Uniformity and that. And that's going to also be to building projects, which were both good and bad. It was impressive, but it was done on the backs of hundreds of thousands of forced labor. Okay, so these things aren't bad things in any way. However, there's a downside to this uniformity, and you can have like this list and be like, okay, oh, I should put the other one here, education, which is certain levels of uniformity in education are a good thing, standards, where then you're like, this is what we're teaching. That's not necessarily bad. If you have complete and total standardization and uniformity where everyone is only allowed to teach the propaganda of the state, that's not good. Freedom of thinking, of ideas is necessary for growth and evolving, developing technology, any of those things. So let's look at, legalist policy in practice, right? You have this list of, good things that happen, but then how that policy plays out. One, thousands and thousands of books were burned because they were seen as dangerous to the state. There is a massive restriction on learning, right? Teachers were required to teach a specific ideology and philosophy about the greatness of the Shin Dynasty and the emperor. If they deviated at all, they were forced into labor. So then you also have like, who wants to be a teacher? Because it's a risky job. Because if anyone thinks you're teaching the kids, and if you aren't sticking exactly to the script, and you're trying to encourage kids to think on their own, yeah, you're screwed. So only those who were like the most loyal, dedicated, brainwashed individuals should have been teachers, because everyone else, and there were thousands of teachers who were imprisoned, and then forced into labor because they did try to step outside of those bounds. There was very, very heavy taxation that not only went to the wealthy, but to the poor. And so when this goes to the poor as well, so I do want to point out, it was for everyone. So let's put that there, because if I write poor here, then it's going to look like, if it's going to stop stalling out here. If I write poor, just poor there, then someone's going to look at that, or you're going to come back and use this and think, oh, just the poor were taxed. Everyone was taxed. But for the poor, it's a harder burden. And it wasn't like the wealthy were super taxed and the poor were not. Everyone had to deal with heavy taxation. But then the poor bared the brunt in terms of what it cost them, and it actually created a larger disparity between wealthy and poor. As much as legalism was against that, and for merit, the system didn't reflect the practical application, if you will. They were forced getting rid of Confucius philosophy. It was seen as dangerous and seditious. There was torture. Again, the whole punishment, which they called chastisement, which again, different word meaning than it is for me to this day of what chastisement means. Forced labor. Right, how we have the building projects we're going to look at next, the Great Wall of China and the Terracotta Warriors. Those were all done. Roads, the palace, this was all done by forced labor. They're impressive building, forced labor, and really no freedom. In fact, there was like the thought police, in that, oops, went way off here. Let's get back to where it was, that there was this expectation that, like, if you thought your neighbor was, thinking seditious thoughts, then you were, supposed to turn them in. So you weren't even safe from, like, thinking things if it appeared that you were. I mean, if you gave any indication that you weren't towing the party line 100% and fully committed, then you ran the risk of being turned in by someone who was looking to move up, to get a promotion, to avoid suspicion themselves, and encouraged neighbors to turn in neighbors. So the two main building projects, right, that we look at, the Great Wall and the whole Great Wall of China. This was not the whole thing. This was the first part of it. It is added onto throughout time. This was done to protect from invasion. There we go. And it was done by both those that were convicted of, various crimes, and that could be almost anything. And then the military, when they weren't fighting, they also provided labor. So this was the labor force. For those who were convicted of crimes, it was very harsh working conditions. Not that it was fantastic for the military, but they were treated slightly better than those that were convicted of it. You had people died of exposure, lack of food, fatigue just from being overworked, dehydration, etc. Right? You weren't given enough food, you weren't given enough clothing, you weren't given enough rest. Some were just straight up put to death while working if they weren't working hard enough. I mean, in the wall itself, people were died / buried in the foundation of the wall of the Great Wall of China. There's still bones to this day of people who died, and whether that was that they fell in and died, or if they were injured, people didn't go down and get them. It was dangerous, and all of both this and the Terracotta Army, but the wall more because they were up at heights and the construction. It created, a super impressive structure, but was very, very dangerous. And then you have the other very well-known thing, the Terracotta Warriors. This, and we'll look at, I have some pictures of this, so we'll look at this in just a second. You have, this was the Emperor's tomb. And so the Terracotta Warriors were life-size. And it included the military, the administrators, entertainment. It was essentially like the whole government. and they were made out of clay, and there were thousands of them. You had over 750,000 people that were forced into labor to make these. In fact, soon after the Shin Dynasty was created, this project was started. So you had a massive, massive forced labor force building this and building these. You had over 7,000 soldiers, and they were all unique, right? So again, we just got talking done about uniformity. And yet the soldiers themselves were very unique. Their clothing, hairstyle, facial features, and postures were all really individualized. They think that this was meant, so we think it was meant for protection in the afterlife. The emperor didn't leave like a journal or writing in the tomb of what the purpose was, but it makes the most sense that it was for this protection in the afterlife. They were all facing current enemies in the direction of the emperor's current enemies, and he got super paranoid by the end of his life. Again, super authoritative figures, dictators, tend to get all paranoid that people are out to get them because, well, people hate them. And he was cruel and harsh, the Shin emperor, and people had reason to hate him. But he did get more paranoid as the years went on. What is ironic with this is that it ended up the Terracotta Warriors ended up providing the weapons for revolt after the Shin emperor's death, because all of the soldiers had actual weapons in their hand. And when the Shin emperor died, the peasants and workers took those swords and weapons out of the hands of the terracotta soldiers and used them to revolt. It kicks the region into like a mini warring states period. And ultimately, the winners of that become the Han Dynasty. And again, the Han Dynasty kind of learned from the Shin and the Zhou of, if you take the good aspects, mostly Confucianism, and then you take some of the good aspects of legalism where it can be beneficial, but leave out all the harsh crap that's just over, torture, forced labor, harsh taxes, just, all the crappy stuff that treats people poorly. And instead focus on this idea of those still having a strong sense of loyalty, as well as uniformity in the things that are beneficial, coupled with Confucianism, makes for a very strong structure and an effective one. The Han Dynasty became a very strong and effective dynasty that led the way in technological advancements, by far. The Han Dynasty developed and created so many modern technological marvels that they were, far ahead of the rest of the world. And you had a whole civil service branch where people were educated through their whole life, tutored in Confucius thought and policy and government, and competed and took exam after exam until this final massive multi-day exam where you were not allowed to leave in this civil service entrance exam. And they were all competing to be civil servants. There was almost always double the amount of people wanting to be civil servants than the positions they had when they did these yearly exams. And you had to go in for 2 days. You had to bring in your mat. You had to bring in your quill and ink and water and food. And you were not allowed to leave the exam process. So remember this when you're taking my exam, how much nicer it is than a multi-part exam where you can't leave. And they were basically in their own little cubicle, and they took the exam. And once you left, it was assumed your exam was done. And there are stories of people dying in these cubicles rather than leave. And some that committed suicide because you literally spent your whole day, that wouldn't be very long, your whole life preparing for this exam, this final exam. And what was so competitive is because they had more people wanting to be part of the government than there were positions, you could pass and still not get a government position. You had to pass and have a high enough score to be one of the ones selected. So it was, if you passed but weren't high enough to get a position, then you could become a tutor and teacher for the next generation, which wasn't a horrible job, but it wasn't as prestigious as the government officials. I mean, so that was the brilliance of the Han Dynasty, is they made being a civil servant like a prestigious position that everyone wanted. And if you failed, I mean, there weren't a lot of options for you. But if you succeeded, then you got a government position that paid well, the prestige that went along with being a government official. And if you were from a poor region, because it was open to anyone to take the exam, oftentimes villages would sponsor, they'd pool their money together and sponsor the people who had the most potential. Because if they got a position, then they could give back money to the village, and it always reaped a benefit to the villagers and the people that live there. So I mean, this was life for people that you had. They successfully figured out what Confucius was trying to do, which was get people invested in the government and wanting to be a part of it. And with a well-run machine of administrative structure and empire, it freed up time for the Han Dynasty to create all of these kind of technologies in medicine and astronomy, and navigation and mathematics. You name it, they kind of had a variety of things where they had discoveries ahead of everyone else because of the kind of efficient system that people bought into, that they were, training their whole life to be able to be part of the government. That's a big, big deal. So you have, again, the Shin Dynasty was this drastic shift away from the Zhou, and then the Han Dynasty was a drastic shift away from the Shin. And not surprisingly, the Shin Dynasty doesn't work. You had one emperor, and people hated it because of over 750,000 forced laborers. It's not a good system. So let's look at these pictures here. I picked this one for like the introduction to the Shin Dynasty, where he's overseeing the construction, and you have all the forced workers of the Great Wall of China, and then the military people, right? They oversaw and occasionally helped, but it was the prisoners that did all of this forced labor here. Here's the emperor, and a lot of his pictures, this is kind of what they have him look like when he was older. Obviously, he ruled for most of his life, and started out very young when the Shin Dynasty was moving from a vassal state to an empire. Here's just an example of the currency from the Shin Dynasty. Again, something that was a good thing to come out of this because of the uniformity and standardization. You didn't have to deal with currency and exchange rates across the empire, because that was a huge thing. The Shin Dynasty unified all of China versus having the vassal states where they all had different monetary systems. Here's just another one showing the construction of the Great Wall of China. So you can see the layers and the step process with the ramps of slowly building up and making it solid, so that it was, almost impossible to get through the wall. You had to go up over the wall. And then just a picture to see. They had these towers, and then they had guards that hung out in each of these towers, right? And there were towers throughout the wall. And then if there was an enemy that invaded, they had these, it wasn't quite that taller than the roof, but they had these by the building bowl kind of things with oil. And if you had an enemy that was invading, you lit that. And then the next guard tower person would see that, and they would light theirs, and so on and so on. And it became an instant relay of information of attack. And then you also knew if they hadn't lit that way, that where the attack was taking place. And so that could get back to the emperor. It could get back to the military commanders to be able to get and mobilize troops where they needed, but it was definitely key of instant notification of enemy attack. And so this is why you have the wall part, and then you have these guard tower areas, not only for housing and food, but also for watch and the ability to warn people if there was an invasion. And then here we have the Terracotta Warriors. Again, this is going, there's some that have, the heads have fallen off, but you can see all the different faces, all the different hairstyles that took place, all the different uniforms. These have a lot of similarities here, but they were accurate in what the military uniform looked like. No. Oh, now it's going to have that. Let me turn that off. There we go. Okay. And then here, just to give you the size of this tomb, right? They have built an enclosure over it, and have tried to preserve what they uncovered. It's massive. This tomb was insanely large. You can see the horses. These people are administrators. Look, they don't have any, so all the administrators here. This thing, it goes on and on. It is absolutely massive for this tomb. And so I like that picture just because it gives you that sense. And then this one was an interesting one of just how they made the Terracotta Warriors, because it was part assembly line, part individual construction. So you have the base of you would create the legs separate from the base, from the body, the torso, the arms, the hands, the head, and the ears. And then that would, so they created these in assembly lines, and then they put it together. Then you have the customization, which also, yes, we don't see this. This is going to be the same for Greek sculptures, by the way. They were painted and super colorful. We only see the plain stuff because the paint is no longer there. But they were painted and super colorful. So were Greek statues. This whole part, number 3, was the factory line, where it was mass produced, right? And then you have the last steps from 4 on of the individual aspects. So technically underneath or at the start, all Terracotta Warriors are the same. And then once they get the base constructed through these different parts that they made through factory lines to keep it moving, then you have the significant individualization, customization. So once they've fired it, you have a unique soldier. And then even more so once you paint it. And so that just gives you an idea of how they made it. All right, that's it for that lecture. We will be looking at the Hebrews and Persians next time.